Xi's participation in the BRICS summit in Kazan, obviously, we did not doubt that it would take place. Xi arrived in Russia for this summit, and yesterday he already had talks with Putin. What topics do you think the two dictators might have discussed related to Russia's aggression against Ukraine? Perhaps some new issues have emerged that needed to be discussed face-to-face. First, we have to understand that the BRICS summit shows that not all leaders are present. This is successful for autocracies that pursue their goals of institutionalizing the axis of evil. They will be discussing an alternative financial system. First of all, creating a model where autocracies can exist in a parallel anti-sanction space and conduct active life, including wars. But we have an opposition in the person of Prime Minister Modi, and an Indian faction is being formed that will oppose this. It is important to understand that what China is developing, and Russia is under it, is already happening. In the medium term, this will have negative consequences for all of us, for all democracies. Therefore, this threat should not be underestimated. As for Xi's visit, we don't know about the final agreements yet. The talks between Putin and Xi are always held in private, but the delegations they bring are often verbose. Traditionally, when Putin visits China, the entire government, heads of top companies, especially energy companies, as well as representatives of Rosatom and other organizations, go with him. Today, the situation is similar. Woke everyone up with their finance and economic ministers and senior officials. The most senior public figures in the field of national security are sitting at the table with him. So it's about security, but it's also about Russia's deeper infusion into China's economic, financial, and military space. As they are now successfully combining their military-industrial complexes, all this will continue to happen, and of course, this will have negative consequences. We can see this in the example of kamikaze drones, which are the Chinese equivalent of shaheeds. From the U.S. perspective, we know that these drones are manufactured in Chinese factories according to the patterns of Chinese engineers and are virtually indistinguishable from Shaheeds. They are being supplied for the Russian war in Ukraine and have already been used against energy facilities and civilian infrastructure. This is what we have to understand about China. China is a party to the war, just like Iran or North Korea. It is simply vulgar, to some extent, to look for some other meaning of the DPRK. Obviously, yes. We're going to talk about this triangle now: Moscow, Benin, and Beijing. But before we get to that discussion, I would like to ask about the participation of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the BRICS events in Kazan. After all, Artur, you also mentioned that India has its own position in this association, which is to some extent opposed to China's position. In particular, yesterday we heard from Indian Prime Minister Modi, during his meeting with Putin, how he called on Russia to end the fighting, to end the war, and to establish peace as soon as possible. Putin did not like them. Indian Prime Minister's words, as evidenced by his facial expressions. There were no such statements from Xi Jinping at the BRICS meetings. What is India's role in BRICS? Why does it remain in the grouping despite its difficult relations with China? And whether India can influence this bloc of countries? Of the Global South. India can significantly impact the expansion of BRICS, which is considering 13 membership applications. While it's unclear if all will join, this expansion will form different groups of influence. India faces serious conflict with China, particularly over undefined borders and China's territorial claims on Indian provinces. But they are trying to balance, to find temporary improvements in this situation. What is India doing? Undoubtedly, it's maintaining the status quo, which is a way for it to maintain a balance in relation to autocracies. It is using all the resources that Russia has, and inexpensive ones at that, because it really needs them. Why? Because India is a fast-growing economy, and it needs a huge amount of energy for its industrialization. They will buy Russian energy resources, and the question here is how they see themselves in 10 years. The other issue is that India, it is strongly tied to pro-democratic alliances, and India is part of the Quad. The Quad leadership talks in Wilmington were extremely successful, and last month India is actually involved in other security initiatives, and in November there will be high-level talks on security review. It is also important that India is strongly linked to pro-democracy alliances. It is part of the Quad and recently had successful talks among Quad leaders in Wilmington. Last month, India was involved in other security initiatives, and in November there will be high-level talks on the U.S.-India security review. It is clear here that India will not side with either Russia or China. It is closer to democracy than it may seem. I think there will be a certain faction that will try to prevent the global goals of Xi Jinping, who is actually running this BRICS summit in Kazan. What are these goals? These are the creation of an alternative financial system, as has already been mentioned, the creation of an anti-sanctions club, so that no aggressor is subject to sanctions. They generally want to time any aggression, and this, of course, involves building a military wing. China planned to present details of its peace plan for Ukraine, but since Lula canceled at the last minute, it is unclear if the presentations will occur. I would like to talk more about this plan, but we are interested in China's attitude to sending troops from the DPRK, since these troops are already stationed at Russian training grounds. Our intelligence and Kirill Budanov have reported that the first North Korean units may arrive in the Kursk region as early as today. That is, they are very close to the battlefield and perhaps even to the front line. At the same time, during a briefing yesterday, I understand, by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, journalists unsuccessfully asked the ministry's spokesman, Lin Jian, 3 times to comment on reports of DPRK troops in Russia. He refused to do so, avoiding this question in every possible way. Why do Chinese government and party institutions keep silent about the events between the DPRK and Russia and the sending of troops? China is behind this. China is orchestrating it. On October 14-15, numerous provocations took place, including Taiwanese exercises and Chinese maneuvers around Taiwan, as well as the disruption of logistics on the Korean peninsula. There were reports of North Koreans planning to join the war in Ukraine. In Beijing, Russian Minister Belousov coordinated these issues with the Chinese defense minister and Xi's deputy in the Central Military Commission. This general, who is not close to Xi Jinping, is developing a plan to invade Taiwan, which shows China's support. When China was asked about its position on the Treaty on the Restoration of Collective Security between Russia and the DPRK, China reaffirmed its support, saying that it would stabilize the global situation.
тому що, за їх словами, це стабілізує обстановку у світі. І найближчими днями РФ ратифікує цей договір, і я думаю, саме з того моменту почнеться активне застосування північних корейців у війні проти України. Але нам завжди варто розуміти, що коли мова про КНДР, це мова не про Росію, а передусім про КНР, про її підтримку, про її згоду і оркестрування. Тому, звісно, тут сформований цей трикутник та регіональний самосхідня Азії, бо так вісь вона набагато ширше, там більше держав, і Китай, звісно, ніяк не буде в це втручатися. Звісно, він буде говорити, що звертайтеся до мене.
In the coming days, Russia will ratify this agreement.
Щодо України, приймайте китайський мирний план, і от я буду займатися деескалацією, але ніхто на це не піде.
I think that from this moment on, the North Koreans will be actively used in the war against Ukraine. It is important to understand that it is not just Russia, but primarily China's support and consent. A triangle has been formed here in the East Asian region, which includes more countries. China will not interfere, but will talk. Come to me, accept the Chinese peace plan, and I will deal with the escalation. But no one will accept it. Earlier, before the evidence of North Korean troops being deployed to Russian bases, there were skeptical explanations that this could not happen because China would not allow it.
Перекинути жодних військ у Росію і, мовляв, не потрібно хвилюватися через це. Але зараз ми бачимо, що це відбувається. Очевидно, відбувається із санкцій.
China is proposing its own unfavorable peace plan, called the Brazilian-Chinese Plan. This is obviously a document from Beijing, which claims that China seeks stability, not war. Therefore, Beijing will not allow Pyongyang to move troops to Russia, claiming that this is not a concern.
Бачить у цій ескалації посилення своєї позиції, можливість диктувати вже свої умови припинення бойових дій.
Мені важко коментувати невігластво, розумієте? Це ті самі люди, які...
It is now clear that this is happening as a result of sanctions, perhaps even at Beijing's initiative or with its consent. The mistake in the explanation is that China is presenting a peace plan and therefore cannot stimulate escalation on the front. Perhaps, on the contrary, China sees escalation as an opportunity to strengthen its position and dictate the terms of the cessation of hostilities. It is difficult for me to comment on the ignorance of these people who first said that Russia would be disadvantaged and then sought ties with China. This is the ambiguity of which Vishal Sinkin is an example. I don't know how to comment on this, because many of these things have been present in the Ukrainian media field for a long time. Experts are so enthusiastic about Russia's greatness that they believe it's propaganda. In geopolitics, this is reinforced by NATO's decisions. Russia is no more, only Chinese Russia remains. Jens Stoltenberg said that Russia's future has already been sold to China. The events in Kazan, the result of China's work, show that Xi is behaving like a master there, which is not a good sign for us. In the context of Russia's war in Ukraine, we are dealing not only with Russia, but also with China, North Korea, Iran, and other autocracies that support Russian aggression. If we look at the situation in detail, we will see that Russian forces are acting against Ukraine, but their weapons are made of Chinese components.
Робиться з китайських компонентів, 93% мікроелектроніки для російських ракет, танків і дронів це китайські.
93% of microelectronics for Russian missiles, tanks, and drones come from China, along with machine tools. Iran supplies chess pieces, and North Koreans are collaborating with Russians. These autocracies are acting against Ukraine, so we must take appropriate action. The key to ending the war and our victory lies in Beijing, which requires greater involvement of Western partners and democracies of the Far East. How can South Korea's position on supporting Ukraine and countering North Korea's military expansion change? Yesterday, the National Security Council of Korea stated that it was considering 3 ways to support Ukraine: economic, diplomatic, and military.
Підтримки України або протидії такої мілітарної експансії Північної Кореї і залученості в бойових діях на українському полі бою.
Most Ukrainians are interested in military issues, said that they are considering the transfer of defensive equipment first, and then offensive equipment, but only under one of 3 conditions. For South Korea, the appearance of North Koreans in Ukraine is not an issue that will unblock everything that is currently blocked as part of large-scale military assistance to Ukraine. For them, what is critical for their national security is what North Korea will get from Russia, and it already has, so it is a matter of short-term prospects. The conditions for South Korea to consider arms transfers to Ukraine include Russia's extensive provision of new technologies for the DPRK's nuclear program, modernization of North Korea's military-industrial complex, and assistance in launching a spy satellite. If one of these conditions is met, South Korea will begin to consider arms transfers to Ukraine. The position of President Yoon's administration is clear. There is great opposition to the transfer of military aid to Ukraine, which is supported by a democratic opposition party with pro-Chinese and pro-Russian sentiments. They fear that active support for Ukraine will destroy South Korea's relations with Russia. For the Democratic Party, this looks like a disaster, but with a majority in parliament, they are still listened to. In South Korea, as a presidential republic, the greatest power belongs to the president, who decides how to deploy aid. The situation in the country is difficult because of the actions of China, Russia, and North Korea. We'll see how it goes further. Thank you for your professional and detailed explanations of the politics of the Far Eastern countries, Russian-Chinese relations, and the general situation. Artur Kharytonov was with us.